What up, Longhorn Nation and college football fans everywhere? We know even some of you Aggies are watching the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel to keep up with what the heck is going on in Austin. I am Chip Brown, longtime Longhorns insider at Horns 24/7, joined by the one and only Eric Henry, a prolific, totally on top of it beat writer for us, just kicking ass. And you kick more butt if you don't stop to take names, Eric. I don't think you're taking names. You're just too busy kicking butt. So we are excited to be previewing the Texas Longhorns, undefeated Texas Longhorns against the undefeated Kansas Jayhawks. Now, I know most Longhorn fans think, Kansas coming to Austin. Last time that happened, it didn't go well. 57-56 overtime. Disaster for the Longhorns. Launched the advertising career of Kansas fullback / tight end Jared Casey and Kobe Bryant, Kansas defensive back who had a pick six in that game. Eric, Texas coming off the 38-6 win over Baylor. Did the Longhorns show you anything in Waco that you needed to see to feel good about the Longhorns as we move along in Big 12 play?
CB, two things stood out to me in the win at Waco, or in Waco at Baylor, I should say. Let's start with the fact that a Steve Sarkisian coach team, if you know anything about his history, offensively, the pre-snap motion is something that is, it's crucial to what he is looking to do. I asked him post-game about it, and he said, hey, we don't run simple offense. We don't run simple plays. We want to use motion, especially pre-snap, because the more we're doing that, the more taxing it is on the defense to try to know what we're doing offensively. Now, through 4 games, or I guess entering the Baylor game through 3 games, Texas had shown much more composure on the road, ironically, with the one road test at Alabama than they had at home. We've talked about the offensive struggles, but that really kind of ties into some of the pre-snap stuff, specifically penalties. They had 6 pre-snap penalties, 5 of the false start variety. One was an illegal snap by Jake Majors entering the Baylor game, and only had one entering the Baylor game. Didn't have one. Then against Baylor on Saturday, they only had 1 pre-snap penalty, and that was one that Steve Sarkisian said was a little bit fluky, in terms of just some of the motion in the backfield. Not putting yourself behind the chains via penalty was big to me, because it showed that they can do it on the road. They have that composure on the road, right? And that, in my mind, Chip, really helped propel Quinn Ewers and the offense to arguably Quinn Ewers' most, not necessarily his most prolific, but his most efficient day as a Longhorn. Was it 17 of 22? If my memory serves me correct, 78% passing. Those things matter. So the fact that they were able to show that type of composure and carry it through on the road, which again, I don't want to poo-poo on Chip, because a critique of Steve Sarkisian coach teams here during his tenure at Texas is that they didn't play well on the road, right? So you can't have it both ways. You can't critique, his staff and his teams for not playing well on the road, and then they go and win on the road and say, they don't play well at home. So I want to give them credit for that, but I want to see them take that same composure and carry it over to games at DKR, Texas Memorial Stadium. Now, the second thing that really stood out to me was this running game. For the last 5 quarters, this run game's looked really good. Or I guess I should say last 8 quarters, if you include the Wyoming game and then the final quarter against Bama, the last 9 quarters. There we go. Get that correctly. Sorry, it's later in the day, and Chip knows it's a Monday. We were at DKR in Belmont Hall for 6 hours, right? So all the numbers run together. So let's try this again.
Yeah, and Quinn was 18 of 23.
18 to 23. 17 to 22, 18 to 23. Got my percentages right.
78% completion rate is best as a Longhorn.
Here you go. So I'll try this again. His last 9 quarters, of Texas football. The run game's been really, really strong, and I think it's hitting at the right time. I wrote about this earlier today at Horns 24/7. The fact that the run game finding its stride as you're getting into Big 12 play, facing some prolific offenses that I know we will talk about a little later on, but that to me I think is especially crucial because you don't want to have the type of rushing performance that you had against Rice and give Kansas more opportunities to put up points. So those two things stood out to me, especially in the win over Baylor, Chip.
Yeah, I asked Quinn Ewers after the Baylor game, are y'all just road warriors? You're a better road team now than you are at home. You get off to better starts on the road. You don't have the penalties. And he looked at me and said, a lot of games left. We'll see. But I don't know what it is, Eric. I don't know if it's the guys having their girlfriends around at home games or something, or they think it's going to be the crowd's going to carry them, the LED light show, whatever it is. They gotta get it going. They gotta kick it into gear earlier in these home games because they did get off to slow starts against Rice and Wyoming at home, and they got off to nice starts against Alabama and Baylor on the road. So this I agree with you, the running game. And for those who are drinking from the cup half full and they're thinking about the Kansas game last year when Texas ran for 427 yards, 243 of them from Bijan Robinson, who just went wild. Texas controlled the clock with the running game. They demoralized Kansas's defense with the running game. And Jonathan Brooks had 100 yards rushing in that game as well. He had a 70-yard touchdown run in that game. For a guy who, and while we're on the subject of Jonathan Brooks, Eric, this guy, he needs a better hype man. Like, he doesn't. Last week we were like, hey, what's your best trait as a running back? He's like, I don't know. I don't really know. I'm not fast. And we're like, huh? Like, you had a 70-yard touchdown run last year against Kansas. And then Steve Sarkisian's talking about how he was clocked at almost 22 miles an hour on his 40-yard touchdown run against Baylor. And it looked for a second like he was thinking about going out of bounds and then just lowered his shoulder and stayed in bounds and finished the run. And he's now got 24 forced missed tackles. He's averaging 6 forced missed tackles a game. Jonathan Brooks, look in the mirror and tell yourself you're pretty darn good. I mean, they've had some situations like this, Eric, with Jalen Ford. Jalen Ford 2 years ago, they were like, you're ready. You're good. You're doing everything right. Just get out there and cut it loose. And he was thinking too much. And then even in the opener last year against ULM, he doesn't have a single tackle, not one, starting middle linebacker. Then he sacks Bryce Young in the second quarter of that Alabama loss a year ago. And it was like the confidence tank got full. He started playing fast. He started trusting his training. Coaches say that all the time. It's like, sounds like blather, but it's true. Jonathan Brooks is ready, man. Just trust your training, cut it loose. You're fast enough. Get after it. I mean, he's a guy that they need, and he had a couple drops in the first couple games, and he had a nice one-handed catch for an 18-yard reception against Baylor. So maybe the hands are back for Jonathan Brooks.
Chip, I kind of think it's twofold, and it's interesting the way you frame it. Again, you haven't been around this program, for a long time, and obviously last year. I think it's interesting the way you frame it, right? Just human nature, right? It's kind of, and I want to see what you make of this. You're as being a sports fan all the way around. I think what separates, the Michael Jordans, the I don't know who else you want to put in the Tom Brady's, right, is in irrational confidence, right? Those guys don't necessarily have to have. It doesn't matter how many times they take the final shot or drive down the field in the fourth quarter. They think they're going to close it out, right? But for the other 98% of the population, we need some reassurance of having done it before to feel like, okay, we're that guy, right? Maybe, Michael Jordan is the 2%, LeBron James, the struggles he had until he eventually became what he was the other 98%, right? Just that unsurety of having done it. I think that's just regular human nature. So for a guy, you mentioned Jalen, and I'll transition to JB, maybe part of his humble demeanor is just him genuinely. I think Steve Sarkisian talked about today, talking about the fact that he sat behind Bijan Robinson and Roshan Johnson, and he learned, how to be a teammate, how to be a leader, and being on the leadership committee, right? And maybe that's just part of JB's demeanor. But I also think part of it is, hey, like he's just getting his feet underneath him as far as, you talked about him having the big run against Kansas previously, but now just getting his feet underneath him as the guy. He didn't even earn the job coming out of camp. It was CJ Baxter, right? So maybe part of that, and I'm spitballing here. So I definitely would be curious your thoughts if you buy or you put any credence in kind of my hypothesis here, is just him kind of getting the confidence and knowing that, okay, I've done it twice now. I've gone for over 100 yards, and I can be that guy who carries the rock 20 times, and that shows out not only in just his play, but maybe his feelings about himself. What says UCB?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't know if he, didn't get enough hugs as a child or what, but this dude can play, and he's earned the trust of his teammates. He's producing on the field. He's always produced on the field. He's producing on the field again. I had him rushing for 1,000 yards this year, so I believe in him. Not that that matters, but I think it's, it's interesting. I just think that he should continue to get better as he gets in a rhythm with this offensive line, as they see him produce, they block harder. It's that feeding frenzy of success. The more success you have, the more you want, the more you're willing to work for it. And so the running game, which was a huge question in my mind. I mean, we did the position rankings coming into the season. I had the offensive line last because I just didn't know where they were in terms of their ability to block for Jonathan Brooks and CJ Baxter. We know that Bijan Robinson and Roshan Johnson made a lot of guys miss and made the offensive line maybe look a little better than they were at times. And I think they're getting better and better. We saw some terrible communication against Rice. Kelvin Banks gives up a sack in the first game to Rice, or he got credited with it. There was miscommunication between he and Hayden Connor. And they've gotten better and better. And DJ Campbell now, who's playing because Cole Hudson, well, he was playing anyway, but Cole Hudson, who started every game at right guard, still out, going to be out for a month with the knee injury. And DJ Campbell was the best rated pass protector according to Pro Football Focus last in the Baylor game. So you're seeing progress. And I think Jonathan Brooks, this offensive line, the sign of a well-coached team is week-to-week improvement. If we keep seeing that, then okay, we're gonna see a running game that can really add up. And they got big tests these next 2 weeks, Eric. Kansas, we're gonna get to Kansas's defense. Everyone's talking about Kansas's offense. Jalen Daniels, Devin Neal. How about Kansas's defense, which held BYU to 9 yards rushing and sacked Keaton Slovis all over the place in a 38-27 win over BYU. Lance Leipold went into the portal and found himself some defensive linemen. And Texas being able to run. Right now, Kansas giving up 93 yards per game on the ground. Okay. And then you got OU that's giving up, 9 points per game, period? And from what I'm hearing from the OU guys, they feel like that defense is real, that it's not just having played cupcakes like Central Arkansas. And SMU, although SMU's 3-1. Got to give Mustangs some credit there. But yeah, we're going to see some real, obviously Alabama was a good test, but now we're in conference play. There's more film. The more you go into the season, the more you've told your story to the opponent, and if there's good coaching, they can seize upon that. So, I just think Jonathan Brooks needs to walk with some swag. We always set him up to talk glowingly, or, hey, what do you think your best trait is as a running back? I don't know. I'm not fast. Come on, JB. We'll be your hype man. Kid from Hallettsville, humble kid from Hallettsville.
Chip, I've found the solution to JB's hype problem. You ready? I don't know why it didn't hit me in the moment, but I know for a fact you're going to agree with me. The answer is lock him in a room with Jahdae Barron for 48 hours. Fair?
Yeah, it's hard to match that guy's confidence. He did tell us 2 weeks ago he loves himself, which, listen, if I played football like Jahdae Barron, I'd love myself too. He had kind of a quiet game against Baylor. They weren't really going at him, Eric. They're not throwing that screen to his side anymore. They're tired of him throwing blockers off and making the tackle behind the line. They're not throwing that stuff his way, it appears.
You will not meet a more confident football player, not a more confident football player. I think Jahdae's confidence as a whole, as like you said, his quote about loving himself, and the one I liked about being a defensive genius. You will not meet a more confident football player than Jahdae Barron. And I think, to your point, Chip, I know you're being a little bit hyperbolic, but I think it holds credence, right? Jahdae walks with that swagger, right? Even when he walks into the press room, he walks with that swagger. When he's leaving, you tell that's a guy who's like, all right, not that he ever gets beat often, but he could misread something, or he could get beat on a play, and he has no doubts that he is going to capitalize on it. I don't know if you saw this quote, Chip. I actually stole it from the podcast with Jeff Howe and Rod Babers, where Rod Babers talked about himself playing in the slot, talking about the history of
no one catches passes on my side of the field, not even me.
That there was that one, but the one that I thought really, in terms of Jahdae, that was interesting, was he said that, hey, he's a guy who, Rod referring to himself, he liked to see it to confirm his read, right? Whereas Jahdae, if that instinct, it shows him what he saw on film, he's going, and he doesn't care if it's right or wrong, right? So that type of swagger is definitely something that you could talk about with JB. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there, that maybe if we just lock JB in a room with Jahdae for 48 hours, and he'll come out and be like, yeah, or I am Earl Campbell Jr., right? Like when the guys walk to the press room, he'd be like, Earl Campbell, I'm Barry Sanders, I'm LaDainian Tomlinson, all those guys rolled into one. So I think that could be a solution there, CB.
Yeah. And then, Jahdae Barron, first thing that comes up about the Kansas game last year was he said he dropped a pick six. He said he dropped a sure pick six, and he did. So, of course, that's the first thing he thinks about when it comes to the Kansas game last year. The Texas defense played great against Kansas, held him off the scoreboard until there was just a few minutes left in the third quarter. By that time, Texas was up 41-0. So this is going to be a really fun chess match. Last year, Kansas defense was so bad, and Texas played them late in the year. So that defense was beaten down, bedraggled, giving up over 200 yards rushing per game, giving up 35 plus per game. Like, their offense averaged 36 points per game. Their defense gave up 35 points per game. It was like, didn't matter how good your offense was, your defense was going to give it all away. And now we got a Kansas defense that's, like I said, held BYU to 9 yards rushing. For Texas fans with UTSD, thinking back to Taysom Hill running all over them for 200 plus in the BYU ground and pound attack of 2013. Let that sink in for a second that Kansas held BYU to 9 yards rushing last Saturday in Lawrence. And BYU typically tough, going to run the football. But Keaton Slovis, the former USC, former Pitt quarterback at BYU, can sling it. And he threw passes to Kobe Bryant, the Kansas defensive back, and it was a rough day for BYU's offense. So, Eric, Lance Leipold gets into the portal and finds Devin Phillips, a defensive tackle from Colorado State, and Gage Keys, a defensive tackle from Minnesota, and Austin Booker, a defensive end from Minnesota. Does Minnesota have any defensive players left? Trill Carter left Minnesota for Texas. Good God, their whole defensive line, I guess, transferred out, or at least all their rotational players. But Austin Booker against BYU last week, 7 total tackles. Again, this is a lineman. 2.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks against BYU. Austin Booker. So that defense was terrible last year, stopping the run. Lance Leipold went and got reinforcements, especially on the defensive line. You can't win if you can't stop the run. And it looks like he's found some guys who are helping Kansas stop the run.
Yeah, Chip, it's really interesting. I know we'll get into it a little bit later and take it or leave it as far as our thoughts on the Kansas defense being legit. So I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but you take a look. You talked about Kobe Bryant, someone who's certainly a very talented defensive back. I look at that defense. I know they have Rich Miller. I know they have Kenny Logan, Romello Dotson, guys like that who have played a lot of football in Kansas. And maybe, just maybe, going to the portal to find those guys to shore up a weakness, Chip, which, I'll sidebar for a second. I think that's probably the most efficient use of the portal for, most Power 5 teams, right? If you're a Group of 5 team, you're looking for anybody, you're trying to improve the talent on your roster, right? But if you're a Power 5 team, I think that's the most efficient use of the portal. If you have a need, right? Let's use Texas as an example, right? They've gone to the portal and, picked up, Ryan Watts came from Ohio State, pick up a Jalen Catalon, picking up, Gavin Holmes, right? Like if you see a need, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a weakness. In this case, it was for Kansas. But if you say, hey, we just need some veterans, some guys that we know, we don't necessarily want to go and we have, some high school guys who aren't ready yet and insert a freshman or an underclassman. We want to go get some guys who've played some football, right? And clearly there are some players on Minnesota's defensive line who teams across the country felt could play in the Big 12, right? So just for, per a little sidebar there, my personal opinion, I think that's the best use of the portal at this level is saying, hey, we need to pick, cherry pick 3 or 4 guys at a position as opposed to necessarily, rehauling or overhauling and reshaping your entire roster. But that aside, yeah, it's really interesting, Chip, to see that through 4 games. It's early. I think for me, the BYU test was really the one that stood out to me. This Kansas defense does look as if it's trending in the right direction. We'll give our take as to whether we're taking it or leave it as far as for the long haul. But I do think it's something interesting really to look at, that now this defense appears to be meeting the task of its of this offense. And that does make Kansas a very dangerous football team.
Yeah, it's going to be fun to see. Now flipping back to the Texas defense for a second, because Kansas runs a spread option attack with triple option principles. And the safeties have to get involved in the running game when you're facing an offense like that. Last year, the leading tackler for Texas was Anthony Cook, who was the boundary safety for Texas. He's obviously moved on. And I asked Sark today about, is Jalen Catalon on a pitch count? Because in the Baylor game, Jalen Catalon played 13 snaps, and freshman Derek Williams played 54 snaps So that tells me a couple things, Eric. It tells me they are trying to maybe protect Jalen Catalon from himself, and he had a great blow-up hit on a running play in the Baylor game that really was the first time we've seen Jalen Catalon read and react from like 12 yards away, take that perfect angle and just destroy a ball carrier. But it tells me, okay, you've got these seniors. You got Jalen Catalon senior, although he's got eligibility if he wants it. Jaron Thompson senior. Keaton Crawford senior, although he's got eligibility if he wants it. You know, they're getting Derek Williams ready, and they're getting him ready now.
Chip, is that the way you see it? I guess here's kind of what I took away. And you did ask Steve Sarkisian that question, and you've asked him that question several times. You know, I want to give you credit there. You know, not in being incessant. It's a very fair question for someone who's been banged up. But this is kind of my takeaway from it, and I want to know what your thoughts are. I noticed this against Rice, that they did shift, rotate out, several safeties. And Steve Sarkisian talked about feeling as if he has a certain measure of depth at that position.
Yeah, 5 deep, he said, if you include Michael Taft, the other names.
It feels to me as if both answers can be true, right? No, Jalen Catalon is not on a pitch count, right? But he's just on a pitch count if he's facing, a team that we think he can go 5 innings and the relievers can get the other 4, right? But if we need him against an Alabama, right? If it's game 7, oh yeah, the pitch count's off, right? I think both answers can be true there. And that's kind of my read on it when I take a look at the Rice game and the Baylor game, which obviously the Baylor game, pretty much got out of hand. You could say more or less after, about a quarter and a half, maybe 2 quarters, it was clear the direction that game was heading in. Okay, why risk it? We have someone who has an injury history, who only knows how to play one way, right? We don't want him blowing someone up against Baylor in a game that they're up, 3 scores, and all of a sudden we've lost Catalon for 5 weeks. But come K-State, or let's say the Kansas game, you need him, right? It's close. That is when maybe the pitch counts off. So that's what I made of Steve Sarkisian's answer.
Your point is made by the fact that against predominantly running offenses, Alabama and Wyoming, he played 32 snaps against Alabama, 34 snaps against Wyoming, only 18 against Rice, only 13 against Baylor.
There you go, right? So that's just kind of the feeling I got from it, which is, yes, 2 things can be true. It's very rare, Chip, and I'm sure you'd agree with this. We ask these questions of coaches, and a lot of times they'll give us a black and white answer, but most times it's not that black and white, right? It's somewhere in the middle. So in my mind, I think that's the case with Steve Sarkisian, is that, yeah, he's not on a pitch count because he can, go all 9 innings, but if we don't need him to, we're not going to take that risk.
Yeah, I think they're going to need him to in this game. And I look forward to seeing how Catalon handles that triple option attack of Kansas. While we're on the subject of young players getting in, the Baylor game, we saw a lot of Malik Muhammad as well. He looks good to me every time he takes the field. He almost had an interception, got credited with a pass breakup. That guy is sticky, man. He is sticky in coverage. And then, of course, we saw Jonte Cook with his first big play as a Longhorn, the 51-yard reception over the middle there in the second half against Baylor, and looked fluid and smooth and all the things that you'd expect of a 5-star receiver. And tell you what, they just got a commitment from Brandon Baker, the 5-star offensive lineman from Mater Dei, where, of course, Steve Sarkisian still has tentacles from his days at USC. And the fact that Texas is playing young players, they played Kelvin Banks as a freshman, they played Cole Hudson as a freshman on the offensive line. Sounds like Sadir Mitchell's getting closer to getting on the field in a meaningful way on the defensive line for Texas. That's attractive That's attractive to recruits, Eric. And even with a loaded roster, this is definitely a Big 12 championship winning roster. They're finding ways to get the young guys in.
I took two things from Steve Sarkisian's answer earlier today when he talked about, developing players, right? And I think that matters regardless of whether you are, a 24/7 Sports 3-star guy, or, you're a high 5-star guy or a high 4-star guy, right? Because how many times have we seen players end up in situations and they don't meet, maybe their expectations or potential coming out of high school, right? Now with the track record they have of taking players and saying, hey, we're getting the most out of these guys. They're playing early. They're having success. I think those things are very attractive. And you talked about a Big 12 championship winning roster. Obviously they're very much stockpiling this roster to compete in the SEC. That matters as well. But yeah, I think if I were a recruit, the big thing that is evidenced by, what you've talked about, the guys you mentioned, is if you come here and you are ready as a freshman, we will put you on the field and you will see snaps. But the flip side of that being, we have a track record of developing guys and getting the most out of guys. And in my experience, players want to be coached. They want to be coached hard, right? They want to be coached to the best of their potential. And the guys who don't pretty much, typically don't work out no matter what level you are, where they are, or wherever they are. So, those guys may transfer and head elsewhere and they end up bouncing around. So yeah, that's a big takeaway, I think, from, again, getting that commitment, as you talked about Steve Sarkisian still having those tentacles on the West Coast, but also evidenced by the amount of underclassmen who are able to come in and make a significant impact, but also be coached and be developed as well. And I think you're seeing that with, even guys who necessarily weren't recruited by Steve Sarkisian, but are making an impact on this team. You talked about it, Chip, Jalen Ford, who maybe was a little bit hesitant, getting the most out of him. David Benda, pointing to him as an excellent example of someone who is being developed by this coaching staff. So I think it's twofold, and it makes an impact, no doubt, in recruiting.
Yeah, you look at some of these guys, the 3-star recruits and getting coached up, and then you look at the talent they're bringing in now. They had to be talked into taking Jalen Ford. I mean, it was an assistant coach at Denton Ryan, where JT Sanders went to school, whose son used to play football at Texas, Alex Delatorre, and his father, Aaron Delatorre, who's the defensive coordinator at Denton Ryan, who said to Texas, why aren't you looking at this Jalen Ford kid at Frisco Lone Star? And Utah was the only one in on him. They flipped him, and Jalen Ford is, the preseason Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year, and just had a big interception in the red zone to keep Baylor, to 6 points on 6 red zone trips, which is phenomenal, especially since special teams, the muff punt seemed to be the hottest play going on Texas special teams against Baylor. So being able to play that sudden change red zone defense is huge. But you look at the 3 stars they were scrambling to get. Now you look at the 5 stars they're bringing in, like Anthony Hill, like Derek Williams, and you see these guys making Malik Muhammad. You see these guys making plays already. There is no shortage of confidence. They don't have to talk these guys into it. These guys know they can do it. They've been doing it. They do it at a different level. And that's why this season is so important to Texas to win big, because they've got the roster. Everybody knows it. You don't want to do less with more. You want to do more with more. And that's why this season is so critical, probably the most important in the last 25 years, because of the momentum they have right now in recruiting, and they're building those lines of, scrimmage. And you want to be able to continue to say, see, we're bringing in talent and now we're winning championships. So why don't you come help us keep that tradition going. And that's so critical this year, because if you fall flat, if you come up short, and coaches can say, you know what, Texas, they're the same old Texas. They talk a good game. They can't get it done. They look pretty, but they can't deliver. You can't have that out there in recruiting against the top end programs, because when Georgia says it, or Alabama, or USC says it, or whatever, Clemson, Ohio State, the high end kids might listen, and you just don't want that negative recruiting message out there.
Chip, I feel like I'm learning this, and maybe I'm just, I'm here in Austin, and maybe I'm falling victim to some of the, burnt orange and white, just some of the what you get here being in Austin. But this is kind of what it feels to me. I fully agree with the point you made in terms of striking while the iron's hot. And I want to emphasize that, because in my mind, it's different when Texas is good and they make the pitch, right? As opposed to you can insert your Utahs, or, I guess, Oregon's had a measure of success, but, I'm going to use like an Oregon as an example, or, I'll use my alma mater, or UCF, some of these programs who I guess I don't want to say flash in the pan, Chip, right? But they've had success. They've been steady at success, right? But it's not the same when a blue blood makes that pitch, right? So when you're talking about going to recruits' homes and coaches saying, "Oh, it's the same old Texas," I think it's a very good point, right? You can make that point about a Miami over the past 2 decades, or some of the programs at Nebraska, some programs have fallen on hard times. But when the Horns are good, and I think that's what I am feeling being around the program now, maybe being here in Austin, is that's like the Lakers making the pitch to you, right? Or a team that's had that track record of success historically. So when Texas is good, and certainly you can make the case that Steve Sarkisian getting that offer from Texas hasn't been as hot as what it's been now for maybe a decade or so, you're not turning that down, right? And I think especially entering the SEC, that's why it is crucial to capitalize on not only the success you're having now, but finish the job, right? Because you're going to be walking into homes and competing against Alabama and Georgia and others, right? So to be able to walk in as Texas, and we'll see where the season takes us, but just the feeling I get, Chip, is that when Texas is making that offer, and there's validity behind that name, behind that aura, right? There's only a handful of teams in the nation who can really compete with that offer, in my mind.
Yeah. How about Steve Sarkisian bragging about Texas being one of the least penalized teams in college football? Meant to look this up in terms of where they rank nationally. Fewest penalty yards. Here we are. Texas 13th nationally, averaging 35 yards per game in penalty yardage. Only Baylor from the Big 12 is ahead of them at 29 yards per game in penalty yardage. But that stuff matters.
Chip, what's interesting though, right, is Texas wasn't necessarily a bad team last year in terms of penalties. They were ranked 66 in the nation in total penalties per game, just over 6. I think the number was 6.3 in 2022. But yeah, that stuff does matter. And the timeliness of those penalties, Chip. I don't want to regurgitate what I said earlier, but I wrote a feature on this in the offseason talking about some of the timeliness of the pre-snap penalties last year, right? JT Sanders has a false start, Chip. I believe it was against
Oklahoma State.
There we go. Oklahoma State, right?
In the red zone.
That right. There you go. Right. So it's the timeliness of those penalties that matter. And taking a look again, I don't want to, just regurgitate what I said earlier, but it's those things that make it harder on teams when you have the pre-snap penalties that Texas is at home. You have a direct correlation to those things putting you behind the chains. And we saw it like what it's done with the offense, right? In terms of being an efficient offense, right? So trying to replicate the success that they've had on the road in terms of, pre-snap penalties and penalties overall, carrying that back over to home. But yeah, just as a whole, the team has not been penalized. I think defensively, Chip, I'll throw this out at you. I think being in the third year under, Pete Kwiatkowski, that matters because you're playing confidently, right? You know what you're doing. You're not thinking as much. Maybe that cuts down on some of the defensive holdings, some of the PIs. I think that was a bit of a questionable PI against Baylor. It could have gone 50-50. We've seen worse, go uncalled, right? But I think those things matter, especially defensively, because you're not thinking as much. You're out there playing football. You know what's being asked of you. You're not committing as many penalties on the defensive side. So yeah, those things do matter. And I think especially, again, as I talk about offensively, you want to see some of those pre-snap things carried over to home, but the timeliness of the penalties especially matter. And it appears through a quarter way of the season, or I guess we're 4 games into a third of the season, that Texas is trending in the right direction.
Yeah, turnover margin. I always look at turnover margin. Right now in the Big 12, Oklahoma leads. They're +7. Houston is +6. Texas is +4 after the twofer combo on the muffed punt returns. Quinn Ewers still has not thrown an interception, and Jaden Blue has 1 fumble. So, turnover margin working in Texas's favor, not so much in the Baylor game, but Kansas, by the way, is +3 in turnover margin. And the statistic right below it on my Big 12 stats is third down conversions. Kansas is numero uno at converting third downs on offense 60.5% of the time. Anything at or above 50% is considered championship level. They're at 60%, Eric.
Again, those things matter tremendously. I mean, and listen, you wrote about this, believe it was Sunday, if memory serves me correct. How much does Steve Sarkisian talk about complementary football? Complementary football matters in terms of, conversion rate, stopping the other team. And I think one of the big things, you threw out that number. I think one of the big things you got to talk about in terms of Texas, red zone defense, fourth down defense. They're among the best in the nation at those things. And in my mind, Chip, again, it sounds boring, right? When you talk about complementary football, turnover margin, those things, right? Everyone wants to talk about the explosive plays and the deep ball and takeaways, but it's playing the complementary football and doing those things in conjunction with the big plays that make a difference between being a 7, 8, 9 win team and being one that is a legitimate contender. Again, it's early, we still have this test against Kansas that we will talk about and see what happens on Saturday, but it's the glimpse, the glimmers of those things, right? Seeing them done that give you the hope that, okay, this is something that can be sustained for the long haul.
Well, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch this Texas-Kansas game this weekend, 2 undefeateds. Before we get to take it or leave it, I had your Central Florida Knights giving Kansas State all kinds of hell, and they did for a while. Central Florida led that game in the third quarter, but then it completely got away. What do we make of your Knights, and what do we make of Kansas State?
What do we make of Kansas State? I think it's more a statement about them than it is UCF. UCF was playing without John Rice Plumlee, right? So Timmy McClain, I know you were high on the Timmy McClain train, and I've seen some people in some UCF group chats, some UCF circles, a little bit frustrated, but those are UCF fans. They're like, a lot of fan bases in the nation. They sway with the wind as far as the quarterback is concerned. One day he's the best quarterback in the world. The next day he's not, right? But in my mind, I think especially defensively, some of the players were out for Kansas State. That's where you want to see Gus Malzahn's team rise to the occasion. So I think it says more about Chris Kleinman's club, the fact that they're able to overcome missing pieces and have an outstanding game on the ground that goes to show that, hey, we're for real. So in my mind, it says more about Kansas State and their ability to persevere than it does UCF, who maybe, I can't think of very many places outside of Orlando who, really felt as if walking into this game without John Rice Plumlee that they were going to be able to, pull off the upset.
Looks like as we've gone on in this podcast, you now are doing this podcast by candlelight.
Yeah, Chip. So we're going to have to find a measure of light here. Usually I can tape this from my downtown Austin high rise and natural sunlight comes in. But Chip, as you can attest, we got the rain yesterday. It was a little bit of a cloudy day and the sun has disappeared. So through the magic of a pause, as we go to take it or leave it, I'm probably going to find a ring light or an overhead light that I do not look as if I'm doing this underneath a Roman candle. The only light that is now in my high rise, which again, I normally can get great light, natural light, is a Monday Night Football that's shining on me. So we'll have to fix that in a second.
Okay. One other real quick nugget. Obviously, Texas Tech lost to West Virginia. Joey McGuire having a little bit of a rough start here to the season. And in the battle of ineptitude, Iowa State beats Oklahoma State over the weekend, and now Oklahoma will take on Iowa State before Oklahoma and Texas meet in the Cotton Bowl for the Red River Shootout. All right. Are you ready for some take it or leave it?
Do it. Some take it or leave it, CB, coming up.
All right. Welcome back to the Flagship Podcast with Chip Brown and Eric Henry. If you are watching on our Horns 24/7 YouTube channel, we will roll along and let's get into some take it or leave it, Eric.
Let's do it. Take it or leave it. And the first one, a very strong one here. Texas is a better road team than home team, CB. Take it or leave it.
I mean, I'm going to take this right now. It needs to change. It needs to change starting like right now because Texas has been a sharper, more focused, better starting team on the road in games at Alabama and at Baylor than they have been at home against Rice and against Wyoming, teams that they were more than 3 touchdown favorites against. So, yeah, and they're less penalties on the road than at home. I mean, about the only thing you can say is the rash of muffed punts that broke out in Waco happening on the road. Otherwise, they've been a better team on the road than they have been at home. But that needs to change. So, Eric, I'm going to take this. How about you?
Chip, I'm going to take it as well. And I thought when I asked Steve Sarkisian the question, the part of the answer that stood out to me, and I think it's real, that as coaches, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have to direct quote, but he essentially said that, as coaches, maybe we need to do a better job of hammering home some of those things, as far as the focus and intent at home as we do on the road, right? Because, when I asked him the question, it was in specificity to pre-snap penalties, but I thought it was revealing, right? Because you tell your guys, all right, we're going to be on the road. There's going to be crowd noise. We got to stay focused, right? Don't jump. And he kind of jokingly said, maybe we need to do that at home, right? Pump in some crowd noise. We're practicing for home games to emphasize that or tell the crowd to cheer, I think was what Steve Sarkisian said. But yeah, I do think those things matter, right? Because when we hear it, Chip, and we're consistently told, all right, we got to make sure we are walking the straight and narrow because we're going to be on the road and all the environments are going to be against us. The elements are going to be against us. We need to make sure we're focused and locked in. I think that stuff does play a factor that carries over, right? To more maybe at home, you get a little bit comfortable and you get a little antsy and you want to make a play in front of the home fans, as CB said, maybe, you want to show up for the girlfriend or your family. I do think that matters. So as trivial as some of those factors may sound, I'm taking it, right? And that doesn't mean it can't change. They've had 2 games now to kind of, have a sample size of see what they do both home and road. I do think the coaching staff is cognizant and aware of it. But as of right now, I'm taking it. And I do think that will change. But as of now, yeah, they're a better team at home than they are on the road.
All right. Take it or leave it. Number 2, Eric. Kansas's offense will be the best Texas sees in the regular season. Take it or leave it.
I was very, very torn on this because I felt like it's a long regular season. I might be a higher on most and that quarterback up there in Norman and Dylan Gabriel. I think he's a heck of a signal caller. He's probably one of the most prolific over in terms of statistically in current FBS quarterbacks. Right? I do think there's some offenses that Texas will see in just the regular season. We're not even talking about postseason that can push Kansas. But man, Jalen Daniels and Devin Neal alone, those two, they really tax defensive, Chip. And this isn't just a flash in the pan, right? You talked about last year, their averages over 36 a game. And the fact that they've come into DKR. And yeah, it was an overtime game, but they've put up north of 50 points. There's something about that guy, Chip. Maybe I am wowed and I'm in awe of the chain with the highlights on it. Maybe that was enough for me that I'm just thinking of that, but I'm taking it, Chip. What says you?
Yeah, and Eric's referring to the chain that Jalen Daniels wore at Big 12 Football Media Days. It was running like highlights of him, his own highlights, and it was pretty cool. Certainly loaded with swag as the Big 12 preseason Offensive Player of the Year. Right now, looking at the rest of Texas's schedule, I'm not blown away. I agree with you. Dylan Gabriel, easily the best quarterback right now, performance-wise, statistically, that Texas will see. But I'm not sure about everything else with OU. And Kansas State, Will Howard, Treshaun Ward's a little banged up. Not quite sure what's going on there. The dynamic nature of Kansas's offense makes it very intriguing. You have to practice specifically to stop the triple option. You can't just apply normal base defense to it. So it requires more. If Texas is smart, they were preparing for it during the summer. But yeah, they did a great job last year of dismantling this offense, Texas did, and keeping them scoreless well into the third quarter. So, but you're right. They came to Kansas 2 years ago, the same cast of characters pretty much, and put it on Texas. Now, that was one of the worst defenses in school history at Texas. And light years, Steve Sarkisian said today, that game exposed warts in the program that we needed to get rid of. And so, he's flushed the losing mindsets apparently from that game, and probably correctly so. But I will take this as well. Because Jalen Daniels can sling it, and he's got a couple receivers. Heck, Devin Neal can catch it. Like I said, they still have that big Oafy dude at tight end, Jared Casey, who used to be a fullback. So I'll take it. That was a long-winded answer to say I'm taking it, Eric. Take it or leave it, number 3.
Take it or leave it, number 3, the final one. Are we buying an improved Kansas defense after holding BYU to 9 yards rushing and producing 2 defensive TDs, Chip? Take it or leave it.
You know what? I'm going to take this as well. And thank God Kansas defense has improved because it couldn't get much worse last year, giving up 200 yards rushing, 35 plus per game. That's awful. But by contrast, Texas in its worst, one of its worst defenses in school history 2 years ago, gave up 31.1 points per game. So anytime you're in that neighborhood, you are losing ball games. But I'm going to buy this. I'm going to buy this, Eric, because I don't know how good BYU is yet with Keaton Slovis and how good they should be. But holding BYU to 9 yards rushing and scoring 2 defensive touchdowns against BYU, that's pretty impressive. Good for Lance Leipold to hit the portal and find these defensive linemen. Devin Phillips from Colorado State, Gage Keys from Minnesota, and Austin Booker from Minnesota. Booker, number 9 in your program, is the one who had 7 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, including 1.5 sacks against BYU. So I'm going to take this, Eric. How about you?
I will take it, Chip, for a lot of the reasons you said, but I'm going to go to the secondary. As I said, I think Kenny Logan is a solid player back there at safety. And also Kobe Bryant, TJ Tampa gets a lot of the headlines as the big time defensive back in the Big 12. But Kobe Bryant, while maybe not quite that TJ Tampa level, I think he's a very, very good, probably an all conference type of performer there in the secondary. So I think those guys in conjunction with the players you mentioned, paired with them shoring up the defensive line, Rich Miller there at linebacker, I'm taking it. They don't have to be, a lights out defense like, the 2000s Ravens or the, Legion of Boom, Seattle Seahawks days, just to be improved. And I think the numbers are bearing that through 4 games that they are an improved unit. So I am taking it, CB.
All right. And Kobe Bryant, this Kobe Bryant spells it Cobee, Bryant. All right, kids. This is going to be an interesting game week. So make sure that you are dialed in over at horns247.com. For Eric Henry, I am Chip Brown. Until next time, we will see you over at horns247.com. Stay safe and keep the faith.